Hi guys and welcome back to the Bike Cave. I've got great news for you today as the time to present you my new brake pads has come. Today I would like to present you my take on what I think to be the optimum rim brake pads for bike trials. However, I fully understand that more feedback may be needed, and so I'll probably continue fine-tuning them, considering any feedback I get in the future from you guys. In this video, I'd like to show you the product development process that led me to the point that I got the strongest brakes I've ever had up to now. So, if you're an older subscriber to this channel, you may have seen me experimenting a lot with the rim brakes of my 26-inch trials bike so as to fine-tune their feel and performance. However, the one thing that I haven't told you yet is that apart from the optimization of the hydraulic system of my rim brakes, I've been also messing around with anything else that influences their braking performance, such as the grinding of my rims, the enhancement of the braking surface using a special rosin coating, and of course, the brake pads I use. Up to the end of 2021, I was regularly using the GT Race refillable brake pads, and frankly I think that they are great, and I was preferring those over other high-end pads I've tried over the years. Their main advantage, apart from the fact that they have a pretty good compound, is that they are refillable and they have an aluminum backing. However, at some point around the beginning of 2022, I had an idea of making my own brake pads as I wanted to experiment a bit with different materials and compounds. And so I entered the rabbit hole of trying new brake pads all the time, experimenting with new compounds, keeping log of their performance, failing a lot, and finally feeling lucky to have gotten to a point that I have the strongest brakes I've ever had. But let's dive a bit deeper into the story and discuss about bike trials brake pads in general. As you may already know, it used to be a quite common practice for trial riders to make their own brake pads. Regular brake pads were stripped of the rubber compound and a polyurethane stock material was cut in size and glued onto the brake pad backings. Actually, the Custelier pads, which are considered to be the most iconic bike trials brake pads, are still hand glued this way up to now. Also, it has to be mentioned that last year, Ali Clarkson released a how-to video discussing this technique in depth. Nevertheless, I didn't want to get an off-the-shelf polyurethane sheet, slice some pads, glue them on brake pad backings and call it a day. I wanted to take it a step further and develop my own unique compound. This allowed me to experiment with many different factors that wouldn't be possible to mess around with if I were to use the standard commercially available material stock. So let's start at the very beginning, and the first thing I did was to get a 2-part hard polyurethane resin for the pads, and if you were to experiment on your own, you should remember that a good starting point is to get a polyurethane resin that will give you a final product that scores around 90 on the Soray Harden scale. Then it was time to make a mold to cast my resin and get my first prototypes, and for that I used a 2-part casting silicone. At that point I didn't know if this was a good idea or if I were to spend a bunch of time and money trying and experimenting without getting the results I was looking for. That's why I made these silicone molds using a pair of GT pads as my pattern model, as I didn't want to invest on anything more expensive at this early stage. Actually, this is a great way to experiment if you want to make your own brake pads like that, but keep in mind that your final prototypes will be smaller than the ones that you use for the mold due to material shrinkage, and so you might have to use super glue to make them stick into the backings that you're about to use. Also keep in mind that polyurethane and silicone are not particularly friendly to each other, and so your mold will not last for long. However, you can make it last a bit longer if you use a compatible mold release, which I didn't at this early prototyping phase. So having made my first prototypes using this method, I mounted them on my GT backings and started riding on my own brake pads. The first batch was made following the recommendations of the polyurethane resin manufacturer, and the end result was quite acceptable regarding their braking performance, although they were quite easy to wear and so they didn't last long. However, this shows that you can make your own brake pads just by following whatever we discussed up to now, and you'll get a rideable set of brake pads, which I liked a bit, but I knew that I could get to a better result if I were to experiment a bit while implementing some ideas I had in my mind. So the tricky part of trial and error started right after this first set of brake pads, and it took me so many iterations to get the final result. I tried to play with numerous parameters during the manufacturing process, and also I tried many different mixtures of materials and different grades of polyurethane so as to fine-tune the braking response and deliver feel according to my liking. However, the development process wasn't easy, as not all product iterations were good enough to ride. This kept back my progress as a rider, as most of the times I was riding with suboptimal brakes. Also, there were many times that I had bad braking performance, and if I was fortunate enough, I had to safely bail while I was losing my braking power. Unfortunately, there were some times that this wasn't possible, and I had a few pretty hard fails while testing some of the compounds I was trying. But I guess that this is what it takes if you want to develop a product from scratch. Nevertheless, after too many tries of different braking compounds, I think that I found the one that combines the characteristics I wanted from my brake pads. So, for the past 6 months, I'm testing the finalized formula for the new Xi Cycling brake pads, and I'm super excited to finally share them with you guys. But before I show you the final product, we have to talk a bit about their design, as well as their backings, which were also redesigned and manufactured for this project. As I've already mentioned, I initially made the first prototypes using the GC brake pads as my model pattern for my first silicone mold, as I wanted to experiment with the various polyurethane compounds without investing into the development and manufacturing of my own brake pad backings. However, when I realized that I had reached the point that my brake pads were actually very good, I decided to redesign the aluminum backings and proceed with the manufacturing of a small batch to test them out. The one thing that I did differently than any other manufacturer was that I decided not to cut any corners and manufacture the lightest and yet the stiffest backings ever made. So to begin with, I engineered the backings to get machined out of 7075 T651 aluminum alloy, which is the best material I could go for, although it was a bit pricey. This decision allowed me to redesign them from scratch and get quite close to their manufacturability limits, removing as much material as possible wherever it wasn't needed, and at the same time ensuring that they are as stiff as possible. The result is that the backings weigh a gram less per pair than any other aluminum backing I've ever seen, and yet they are super strong and stiff. Yeah, I know 1 gram per couple of brake pads is not much, but it was the best I could do in that case. I know that the basic design concept of the brake pads is heavily influenced by existing designs, such as the GC ones that I already had and the TNNs, but every dimension and every geometric feature of the aluminum backings has been re-engineered and optimized to maximize the strength and minimize the weight. However, I kept the configuration of the mating interface between the backings and the pads exactly the same as the GC ones, as a specific mating interface is also used by other companies such as TNN, and I strongly believe that standardization could push companies to make interchangeable products, leading to more choices for the end user. So if you have a GC or a TNN pair of backings, you can use the new Xi Cycling brake pads refills and vice versa. So now that I have completed the development of my brake pads and I have used them for sufficient time to properly test them, I proudly present you the new Xi Cycling brake pads. As I've already mentioned, I'm pretty happy with how these brake pads turned out, and I'm excited to share them with you guys. Thus, if you want to get a pair or two of these brake pads, you can get them directly via our shop over at bikecave.eu, and by doing so, you're also helping this channel and motivate me to go on with my quest to develop more products and tools. Moreover, if you visit bikecave.eu, don't forget to check out the specially made rim brake rosin that can be rubbed to the braking surface of your rims to instantly increase your braking power. Anyways, I hope that you liked this one and you got an idea of what it takes to develop even a seemingly simple product such as these rim brake pads. But I would love to know what brake pads do you use and whether you've ever tried to make your own brake pads. Also, what Bike Trials product should I redesign next? I've already got some ideas, but I would appreciate if you tell me yours. Thank you so much for subscribing and watching, and until next time, have fun riding your bikes and make sure that your brakes are as snappy as possible.